how did Bastyr University get started?
Oh, well, after Joe graduated, they decided that we needed a school here.
So I got to go with my friends Les Griffith and Bill Mitchell and said, hey, why don't we do this? Mm-hmm. So we sat around Bill Mitchell's famous kitchen table back in April of 1978 and decided to do it. And so Les said, well, I'll teach some classes, and Bill said, well, I'll recruit some students. And I looked around and said, okay, well, I'll be president.
So he and Les and Bill Mitchell went down to Olympia and got a corporation started.
My job, since I was president, was to go down to meet with Dr. Bastyr and ask for his permission. Mm-hmm. He didn't give it to us. He said, no, you can't use my name. Now, I think there's kind of two reasons for him to do that. One was he was a modest man, he didn't want that. Or the other one was, who are these young guys, what are they going to do with my name? You know, it could have been either way. And being the kind, sensitive young man that I was, I said, Dr. Bastyr, we're going to name the school after you anyway because of what you represent. And if you want, and the way to stop me is by getting an attorney. No, I actually said that to him. What a terrible thing to do. What a terrible thing to do.
With my name on it. He came out the house and said, well, you are now part of a corporation. I said, oh no. You know what my name is.
But there's good news. Okay. So many years later, the class of '85 asked if we give Dr. Bastyr an honorary degree in the school that was named after him. Mm-hmm. So we gave him the honorary degree. And with tears running down his face, he said, I had always wanted this. So anyway, so I felt vindicated.
You did the right thing.
I did the right thing.
Yeah.
I mean, he deserved it. Yeah. And second, of course, by the other side, he had no way of knowing whether we do a good job in his name or not. And we did.
But they did. And so that's been on since. Mm-hmm.
I had gone to a birth, like to a home birth, and I just thought, this is amazing. And so then I went, and I'll never forget it. It was such a visceral feeling being in there, and just watching this incredible midwife, and just how second nature the whole thing was, and the woman giving birth, and her crying out, and just the way the midwife was just stroking her brow and just getting the sweat off of her face, and the baby, and the father comes in. I mean, just the whole scene was just like, that is amazing. And then I heard that the midwives were getting blacklisted, and the social justice part of me just rose up, and I just said, that's it. I'm going to be an OBGYN. And that was my first, really kind of saying, wow, I think that's really what I want to do with my life.
When I entered medical school, sulfa had been just invented. And so we used sulfa powder in abdominal wounds. And it was a miracle. The infections were stopped, and it was just amazing. And then, and that was I started medical school in September of '41, and the war started in December 7th of '41. So it really was during that time. And then it was in about 42 or 43 that penicillin was discovered. And this was another huge miracle. And towards the end, we were beginning to get into the use of steroids, just beginning. And then, of course, all of the different procedures that came about because of the war injuries and so on.
So what was it like? Tell me about first entering Palmer College, and what were your aspirations?
It was very exciting to me. I felt like I had purpose. Mm-hmm. Feel very blessed. I have always felt like I was chosen. Mm-hmm. I didn't choose it, if that makes any sense. It chose me. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it was very cool. It just had a reason, had purpose, mm-hmm. knew where I was going, knew what I was going to do, and was totally committed to it, beyond a commitment that I had ever had to anything.
I wept that first. I remember calling home and weeping, and my mother would say, "Oh, you wanted this so bad. Why? And you're so lucky. Why are you feeling this way?" I remember the professor with his little bow tie, and I'm trying to see myself in some of the professors, and it's like I'm not trying to find, like, okay, so where am I going to find my home in this environment? And he, was saying, you are the future leaders of this country, and you are the scientists. And I remember sitting there, and it's like a tear just started going down my face, and I thought, I am a scientist of sorts, but I'm mostly an intuitive. And in science is really just in the service of that, to the best of its ability. It'll always be changing. And I felt, again, that sensation, like how am I going to find my home here? Where will I find my home? So that's kind of where it started, and that's a theme that has reverberated its way through. After all these years, I think I feel like because I feel more at home within my own skin, and I also see beyond the veneer of what all that is. I feel like I found my home.
And the other part was I discovered an organization run by medical students who had a whole action committee just focused on humanistic medicine.
And that was?
The organization was the
AMSA.
AMSA.
Okay.
Yeah, that was probably what impacted me the most during med school. A group of activist oriented students who really just wanted to bring more healing back into medicine. That here wasn't the solo student who felt like, what happened? Where is the healing? Where is that questioning of why is it this way?
By the time 2 years, I was totally burned out. Actually, I actually hated medicine. I said, why did I do this? This is insane. Why would anyone become a doctor? All I did all day long was write prescriptions. I had no time to think about a patient. All I thought about was my crowded waiting room and how am I going to get through the day and take care of this sea of humanity that was out there. And maybe 5 to 10 minutes with a patient. Yeah, whatever, Here's the antibiotic, whatever. I didn't get to know anybody. I mean, a few people kind of did. But some reason we were successful. Somehow the place grew. Well, the doors are full and there's people coming in. Were they getting better? Doubtful.
It was a culture shock when I started breaking out of the very conventional allopathic view of what an illness experience is supposed to be like.
My wife has had a tremendous influence on me in this area. But it has taken a lot of humbling of my pride to be much more open to the idea that mainstream medicine doesn't have all the answers, and so.
If I could digress a little bit,
yes.
That's a really big theme that I think we all have to face as physicians, is a humbling of our pride.
Yeah.
Can you mind expanding on that?
I think that I just went into medicine with a lot of intellectual arrogance, to be quite honest, and that carried with me. And of course, it's groomed in the system. On the one hand, you're in a position of great responsibility and can affect people's lives, and you're in a respected position. So there is a sense in which you've got to, fill the shoes with confidence. But I think that the medical education process is one that is endemic, or one where arrogance is endemic, or pandemic might be a better term.
Give me a picture of who you were in 1982.
Well, let's see, by that time
I'd learned, obviously, quite a bit of medicine, studied hard in medical school and things. I'd also gotten at least a clue by that time that the conventional medical model wasn't a complete model of the human being in health and illness. I already kind of knew something was amiss by that time. But I did learn a lot about the sort of the midwifery model of birthing as opposed to what we'd learned in OB, in the medical model of birthing. And so I really knew there were different things. I still didn't know anything about chiropractic or naturopathy or, I took one nutrition class that was offered at my school, which was an elective.
Even in medical school, you knew that it was not a complete model.
Right.
And part of it was inspired by the midwifery model.
And that the psychological aspect was important, which wasn't mentioned in medical school back then. I'm sure they do now.
Now, fortunately, she showed me the book, so we got a copy.
Which was?
Adele Davis, the one that Adele Davis put all the footnotes and citations in. The one called, let's see, Right to Keep Fit.
I remember.
So I put it up on the shelf. And probably 3 or 4 months later, someone else came in with a problem that hadn't been solved by all the usual means. And she said, what can I do about this nausea? And I looked through her record, and sure enough, she'd been tried on all the usual anti-nausea preparations. They didn't help her that much. Went in the next room, got my book, Adele Davis book, because I hadn't been taught anything for this, so maybe it's in Adele Davis. And what do you know? Adele Davis had a nice little exposition of the interaction between estrogen and pyridoxine. And by the way, here's the footnote and citation that says so. Okay, so I went back and told her to get some vitamin B6. And she went on down to her health food store, got some vitamin B6. Nausea was gone in 3 days. Well, at that point, I decided I had this giant hole in my education. And I took Adele Davis's book with all its footnotes and citations and went to the University of Washington Library. And oh my goodness, all this stuff was in the medical journals, and it had never, ever been mentioned at Michigan. And yet it was the basic building blocks of the human body.
In medical school, what I learned was the body is fallible. Pretty much, without the doctors, you're screwed. And make sure that you know the right pills. In research, I had a much different feel of the body. And especially the research I was doing was about the blood vessels. It was about programmed cell death, apoptosis. And it was just about understanding how does a body manage on its own without actually us interfering. I got a PhD in molecular biology and just followed with research there. And so after 7 years there, I felt it's time for a change. And I really felt over time that I wanted to go to the deeper understanding of what makes the body actually run. What is a connection between what we are thinking, what we are feeling, and what's happening inside of our cells. But there's something inside of us that knows how to develop from an egg and a sperm into a fully functioning human being. There's something that knows exactly when we cut ourselves how to heal that wound. So there is a knowledge inside of us that I find we are often not only underestimating, but we are also not really tapping into.
3 years into practice when I went back to Bastyr. And that also was motivated by sitting with a patient. And it was a woman with rheumatoid arthritis. And, just kind of looking at her hands and I, in our training, we actually learned that it was a compassionate thing to say, there's nothing more that we can do for you. That was a compassionate thing to say. And so I actually had said that. I was reading all these, like natural health, and I was reading all of these other ways of working with people, with nutrition and with herbs and with homeopathy. And I was actually starting to treat my kids that way. And then I realized that it hadn't really translated into my practice. And I thought, these are my family. Like, there is something I can actually do for this person. And so that's when I went back to school at Bastyr. And I realized that there are so many things that we can do for people. And I've also, I just feel like I have learned so much. The whole idea there's nothing more to offer is kind of, it's kind of like Alexander the Great. When he came to the end of the known world, he just sat there and cried, like as if there is such a thing as the end of the world. It's kind of like Western medicine bumps up against its own limit, and it says that's the end, rather than saying, just piercing through that or wondering, there must be something beyond this. And I feel like that's, being able to open into other ways of looking at things, and knowing that there are traditions that are beyond what we have trained in. And on behalf of ourselves and the patients that we take care of, just to be able to learn about those things, and even if we don't practice them, to know that there are other people, that we're part of a really large healing community with different healing possibilities.
I call this a divine appointment, okay? That's what I call it. Before I left Alaska, one of the doctors interviewed for my position was an MD, PhD professor from the University of Chicago. Mm-hmm. And then I asked him, it didn't make sense, why would this guy, this qualified guy, take this GP type position up here? He said because his wife couldn't live in Chicago anymore because of the pollution. Now this is back in 1975. She couldn't live in the Chicago because the pollution was so bad, and she couldn't live in the suburbs because the pesticides were used. She was so sick, and they were looking for clean air and clean water. And I thought that was interesting. He says, I never heard of such a thing. And he told me, I said, well, how did you find out about it? They told me about this Dr. Randolph, Theron Randolph, in Chicago. And he said he's a doctor who's an allergist who's far ahead of his time. He said, you ought to look him up. And so the name registered, Theron Randolph. And it came up again. Then I forgot about it, Then I'm doing my research. I took some time off, my wife and I traveling around the country in a van and stuff, And I read Prevention Magazine at that time too, Jonathan Wright. Oh, that got me influenced too, Jonathan Wright's Prevention Magazine. He wrote a monthly column. And in Prevention Magazine, they mentioned Theron Randolph, a neuroallergist. I said, I got to check this guy out. What is a neuroallergist? And so Randolph is an allergist. He's a Harvard-trained allergist. So I call him up. He asked me to come by and spend some time with him. I went there for 2 days, and right away, you can meet a person and know there's something solid and integrity and honorable about him. He was one of these guys, So anyway, I ended up spending 1.5 years with him, training in this center we had
in Chicago,
outside of Chicago, a hospital called in Zion, Illinois. Mm-hmm. It was like a holistic hospital. Oh. He has this hospital unit with 30 beds on it, and it's environmentally controlled. Double doors, super air filtration. Wow. Everything is made out of steel, glass, and tile and cotton. No synthetics allowed. No fragrances, no nothing. And so we take these very sick patients from around the country. It was a referral center that other environmental medicine doctors couldn't work out in their office. They were so sick. And we'd fast them for 5 days on water. I'm talking about migraines, asthma, arthritis, hyperactivity, eczema. It was amazing. When I finished there, I knew, what I call it, born again is the term I used into medicine, because I realized that this was what eat and drink and breathe is what's causing diseases. It's the most biggest problem that's facing the country in our health. I decided I was going to practice that kind of medicine for now. But then it was come to my mind, but I'm also scientific oriented, and I want to know, does this make sense what this guy's doing? And does it make sense from a scientific viewpoint? So I did a residency in occupational medicine at the University of Washington after that. And everything that Randolph did was right. Everything he said, you couldn't, environmental pathology, toxicology, it bore out totally.
And I stayed with a guy I knew in France who lived a block away from Dr. Bastier's office. And that's where I ended up living, when I moved to Seattle. I introduced myself to Dr. Bastier, and when I was a fourth-year medical student, and then I eventually got an internship at Swedish Hospital, and I've lived in Seattle ever since '75. And then I got to know Joe Pizzorno through him, and spent time with Joe Pizzorno and Bill Mitchell.
So 75, I went out to get into private practice. I passed the state boards and opened up my private practice within like just a month after I graduated. And I did something really smart, and I was really lucky. And that is Jeff Bland was doing monthly study clubs. At the same time, Jonathan Wright and Alan Gaby were doing a monthly study club, and they walk in and put a stack of patients on the table, and we talk about patients. So I was able to really improve my clinical skills quite dramatically during that time.
You know, as an ER doc, you work a shift, maybe 6 shifts a month, and you have all this time in between where I learned acupuncture and I learned shiatsu, and I went to Jeff Bland's early courses, and I sat in with Jonathan Wright in his office. And
a group called the American Academy of Medical Preventics. It had been completely new information. I'd never seen in medical school, never seen in residency, never seen at the leprosy hospital, never seen in a medical journal, and that was my introduction to alternative medicine. Wow. And I found out that in the summer of 77 that there was a group called the Northwest Academy of Preventive Medicine, which was based in the Puget Sound area. Probably one of the main speakers was a biochemistry professor at the University of Puget Sound.
Jeffrey Bland.
Jeffrey Bland.
I did a residency in occupational medicine at the University of Washington after that. And Jonathan Wright came up to talk one time to this group of medical students, and I met Jonathan. And right away we hit it off. He says, why don't you come down and talk to me when you finish? Because he knew about Randolph. He knew about food allergies. When I finished my residency, I started working with him. So I spent 5 years with him.
And what happened? Tell me about those years.
Well, they were really good years, you know. I mean, Jonathan really taught me. He really helped me get started, so he taught me a lot. He really got me jump-started about nutrition. Really was really good teacher, very patient with me, very smart. The guy is real smart, you know.
And so I got to try things that were in all this stuff I was pulling out of the University of Washington Library.
So you spent a lot of time running
lots of time at the library. Not as much as Alan Gaby, though. That man
when did Alan join you?
That man spends more time at the library.
Wait, how'd you meet Alan?
In 1976, I started writing monthly columns for Prevention magazine. That's at the time when it was Prevention magazine. So Alan had been reading those when he was in medical school. So he sent me a letter in, I believe it was 1978 or 79. And so he came out and spent a month, and then he went back to medical school. At that time, he was late 3rd year or early 4th year. Then he finished his 4th year, did 1 year of internship. He knew also, like I did, that he wasn't interested in doing a residency in anything regular. He wanted to learn this stuff.
I attended my first AHMA meeting while I was still in Maine. And I don't know how I did it, but I had met Christiane Northrup. Yeah, that AHMA meeting was really helpful, because again, I was just starting out, it seemed like, and to hear, I think that's met Paul Brenner, and met Bob Anderson too. Yeah, so that was really handy. Yeah, so what happened though was I started to learn some of these things that were a little more out there than the manipulation, like homeopathy, and I felt this need for more professional freedom. And I couldn't get it where I was practicing because it was a hospital-owned clinic and I was just an employee there. And that's when it felt right to come join Seattle Healing Arts, join you at Seattle Healing Arts. And that's when my learning really exploded, because I was able to really practice what I was learning. I'd also started learning the cranial work by then, as an expansion of the manipulation I was doing. I learned the cranial work, and but then sitting there for an hour, really feeling these subtle rhythms and listening to what the body's trying to say, at the same time asking the patient questions about what they're feeling and how they interpret what they're feeling, that opened up a whole nother layer of learning.
It was very interesting. So the first year I did philosophy. So I went, and I feel like so much of what happened is that I unwound a lot of the party line that I had learned in medical school. Like I feel like a lot of my journey is what is it that's really, that's worthy of respecting and keeping, and what's like just judgments and opinions.
I believe in the wisdom of the cells, and I believe that illness shouldn't be just brand marked as bad and evil that needs to be fought, but really something that needs to be read and understood, and then taking the time to resolve together with the patient. And that's the role shift. That's the shift of the doctor being the knight with the shining armor who is fighting the enemy to, I'm actually the one who is counseling through the healing process because you have been in disharmony with your physical body and probably also with, your mind and your emotions. How can we bring you back into harmony? It takes time. This is not a 12-minute visit. I believe there is a need and a demand of people to wanting to be more responsible for their own health and wanting to be more actively involved than just being the passive bystanders of what the doctors are doing to them.
And I'm not one of these guys that's anti-drug, anti-FDA, everything's out to get us, or these are all, they don't know what they're doing, or I don't have that feeling. I think all these doctors, we're all brothers and colleagues. We all have our own thing they're all trying their best to help people, and they do the best they can in the situation they're in. I also think a lot of these poor doctors are locked in these HMOs would like to do this medicine. I bet in their hearts, some of them, if not a lot of them, would like to do it. But they can't think out of the box because they're trapped. They cannot possibly step outside their thing that they're trapped in. But I have a feeling a lot of them think this is not good. I mean, I've heard enough stories. When I did that practice in Alaska, I had to see everyone about every 7 minutes. I can't imagine practicing like that. How disheartening that must be for these poor people, And they become doctors to help people, and I don't think they really, a lot of them don't like it. That's my opinion. I don't know,
Let's go from undergraduate, and then they enter into medical school, and then they get swallowed up, and they're like babes. They actually have not, they're not high, I know they have a college education, but their sense of really what it is to be out in the world and what the world is, it's not really very developed. And then they just get swallowed in, and then with how medicine is, so then they end up all really in debt, a lot of money, yeah. and then they go out and they just propagate the system, because the system will pay them for that. And so the idea of developing another way of doing medicine is not, unless they're independently wealthy, they're not really able to do that. And so now we have very little private practice, and everything, it's the trend, the institutional trend is so strong. You look at, education in Europe, they don't end up, it's paid for. They're not indebted, and they all go out and they do mostly little private practices, and they're part of communities, and it's just a really different way, and our whole system is so embroiled. So it's like to deconstruct it, it's like we have to look at the whole picture.
Actually, I'm certain when you started this and when I started this, there wasn't really language for what, we've kind of codified it into a language that's still continuing to evolve, and a conversation and an integrative experience that's still evolving. But yeah, I didn't have a format to follow. It just sort of organically grew out of direct experience and a sense of my knowing that even though I feel I had a very, very great training experience in allopathic medicine where I trained, no question about it, there was always this sense that it was incomplete. I only had one lens, and I only had a limited tool bag, and a lot of those tools that I had caused as much harm as they did good, and it was just kind of this balancing act for a long time until the body system kicked in. And I didn't really know, actually, I can honestly say I didn't know at that time that the healing came from within. I thought the healing came from what we did, or what we gave them. that actually the medicine cured. And it was delightful to find that the medicines or the treatments or the surgical repairs or the excisions of something malignant just allows the body an opportunity to right itself. So it stops a process so that it can regroup and reorient the intelligent design that created the human being in the first place.
It's that shift, it's a paradigm shift, it's a complete paradigm shift. It's the difference between paint-by-number medicine and actually involving with the person's need and what they're really learning this lifetime as we work with real healing and find out that, you know, I've watched beautiful jobs of surgery that don't heal. I've watched botched up jobs of surgery that heal very well. The question is, who's doing the healing? It's that reality that every person has to do their own healing. We're there to support them. That we're partners in the healing process. But we don't do any healing, really.